In the NBA's long history, we've seen many rebuilds bring teams to the promised land. Some of these take time, some of them happen quick, but either way, sometimes your team needs to be knocked down to be built back up. What's up guys, it's Colin from Next Man Up, and today I want to talk about the best strategy to rebuild a low-level team all the way up to NBA champions. We've seen a lot of teams in recent memory find success in a rebuild. The Grizzlies quickly moved on from the grit and grind era and look to be perennial contenders in the West, and the 76ers process has led them to being serious finals contenders the last couple of seasons. But there's one recent rebuild that brought their organization all the way to a championship trophy, and they did it from homegrown talent. So let's look at how they went from league worst to championship contenders. The Milwaukee Bucks rebuild happened more by force than by choice, as the team was stuck in the limbo zone of being a non-contender but being good enough to compete for a playoff spot back 10 years ago today. That Bucks team was catapulted into a rebuild when their big man and arguably best player, Larry Sanders, got injured and was forced to miss a majority of the 2013-2014 season. Now, the Bucks rebuild wasn't always pretty, but by following the steps that Milwaukee took to become one of the most dominant forces in the league, maybe one of the NBA's current young squads could repeat their success. So with that being said, let's see how the Milwaukee Bucks made a name for themselves in the NBA. First off, let's talk about the draft. The biggest question for a rebuilding team is what kind of player do you look for in the draft? And based on how the Bucks did it, I think you gotta go after those high risk, high reward type of players. Rebuilding teams are never going to make that next step unless they take some risks. The Bucks are a perfect example of a team who did just that, and they saw the rewards and also the failures of doing so. The obvious player we're talking about is Giannis Antetokounmpo. After another disappointing season, the Bucks needed to take a chance, and they did just that when they swung at Greek big man Giannis Antetokounmpo in 2013. I talked about that Giannis selection a lot in my video, which was titled 2013 The Year of the Bust. But as you guys know, Giannis was not one of those busts in this class, but quite the opposite. The unknown Greek phenom developed into one of the best players in the world, and if the Bucks decided to go in a safer direction and take someone who was a contributor in college and maybe someone who had a name for themselves, they never would have reaped the benefits of taking Giannis. The Bucks rebuild would have never succeeded without him, and taking the risk to draft him was the first step to all their success. Another draft selection that's important to mention is Jabari Parker. After another tough season in 2013, the Bucks held the number 2 overall pick and needed to add a game changer. This player would be someone who could be paired with Giannis for the long haul if they pick correctly. And with the pressure on them, the Bucks went with Jabari Parker from Duke over Joel Embiid from Kansas. At the time, Parker was seen as a safer prospect who would transition to the league well, but in this situation, their strategy to take the safe route failed. Who knows what the Bucks would look like if they selected Embiid, but I do think this reinforces the idea of valuing those make-or-break prospects when you're a team in need of a rebuild. I know it can bury a bad team to take a draft bust, but the reward is historically too good to pass up in most cases. Now let's talk free agency. I think the big question about free agency is what kind of players do you want to sign? I think the best way of going about it is not overpaying your contributors too early into your rebuild. In the 2013 offseason, the Bucks allowed guard Monte Ellis to leave in free agency. This move probably disappointed some Bucks fans at the time, as statistically Monte was one of the best players on that team, leading the 15-win squad in scoring and starting all 82 games of that season. But it was obvious to the Bucks organization that he wouldn't be a key contributor to a championship squad in Milwaukee, considering he was turning 28 the next season and he just wasn't efficient enough to gel with a young Bucks team going forward. So with that being said, you really shouldn't break the bank unless you're already close. And what I mean by that is, even though I'm sure the Bucks were interested in bringing in big names in free agency, they decided to tap out and address their team needs in different ways, all the way up until 2019, when they brought in the defensive big man Brook Lopez. The Bucks in 2018 looked much different than the team we talked about at the start of this rebuild. At this point, the Bucks had already solidified themselves as a playoff team, and moving on from Jason Kidd, they saw it necessary to invest in a big man to pair next to Giannis. Getting an unselfish big to fill out their already solid team was a major reason why they jumped to success. And once you see improvement, you gotta lock in that core. The Bucks have maintained success recently because they've been able to hold on to their core contributors. If these guys walked away for a payday, their efforts would have been lost. So it's important to maintain good relationships with your star players, especially when you're on the upturn of the rebuild. So now let's talk about trades, probably one of the most fun parts of the rebuild. When you're trading on a rebuilding squad, what kind of players do you look for? To me, you got to get contributing role players and a little bit of bridge talent along the way. Sticking with his Bucks team, let's kick it back to 2014. The Bucks worked out a signing trade with Detroit to move on from guard Brandon Jennings and acquire Brandon Knight. Jennings was a young guard who had shown some really incredible flashes, including a 55-point outing against Golden State the year before. But the team knew they would have to pay Jennings and decided it wouldn't be worth it for their future. In this trade, the team acquired Knight, who was another young project guard, and were thrown in the underrated, unknown Chris Middleton as well. Now, Milwaukee didn't make a ton of huge trade moves in the years following, but let's fast forward to 2020. Milwaukee's on the upturn of their rebuild, still looking to lock up their point guard position, so they grabbed the all-defensive Jrue Holiday. Holiday fit the Bucks scheme perfectly. His ability to score was useful when needed, but his on-ball defense and playmaking abilities made him a perfect pairing for the more ball-dominant duo that he was playing alongside. I guess my point is, with these rebuilding teams trading, it's kind of the same vein as free agency. Don't look to make that big move, but look to get the right guys on your squad along the way. It's going to be a process. Now let's talk about coaching, an aspect that's sometimes not even considered. I think a big question for a lot of rebuilding teams is if they should hold on to their coach and stay loyal, or fire them after a bad performance. To me, it doesn't have to be one or the other, but I do think you should keep them on a short leash. And I say that because in the last 10 years, Milwaukee has had 5 different head coaches, but the ones towards the start of the rebuild lasted a lot shorter. It may sound obvious to some fans that you should fire a coach if he's not meeting expectations, but I think the Bucks situation shows that loyalty at the head coach position only brings you so far. In order to propel your team to new heights, you need to bring in new systems and new leaders. That goes for players, so why should it be any different for coaches? I also want to mention a lot of great rebuilds have a bridge coach. In the Bucks case, that was Jason Kidd. Kidd lasted 3.5 seasons with the Bucks, and even though he wasn't a great coach by any means, he had a lot more to work with, and in his couple years with the Bucks, he promoted the development of Bucks star duo Giannis and Middleton. So despite his inability to bring the Bucks anywhere close to the promised land, him opening up more opportunities for players was crucial for that team to rebuild successfully. Another factor that's very hard to measure is luck. In order to be a great rebuilding team, you do have to get super lucky, but you also have to make sure you can develop the sleeper players that you get along the way. Smart trades and signings can only take you so far. At the end of the day, you have to get lucky. When the Bucks acquired Chris Middleton, he was a player who would be essential to the team's success, but they got him as a random filler player in a trade centered around Brandon Knight. That is incredibly lucky and something that the Bucks probably didn't even consider. As I mentioned earlier, you do need to get lucky and hope that some of the role players on your squad can reach their final potential. Guys like Bobby Portis and Dante DiVincenzo became bona fide starters for that Bucks team that won the finals. There's a lot of scouting and thought that goes into that, but you still have to get lucky and hope that the personalities on your squad gel together. And the last step has to be patience. I know a lot of people wonder, how long does a good rebuild take? But there is no solid answer for that. We've been following the Bucks in this video, and that rebuild took around 7 years, but there is no exact timeline, and it's important to consider that in real life, there's a lot more on the line than I make it sound like in this video. GMs and owners have a ton of pressure to succeed, and their jobs are often on the line. So for some of the top dogs, spending a long time on a rebuild may not even be a realistic option. But for Milwaukee, they stayed patient with their core and let the pieces fall into place. And at the moment, they're some of the top dogs in the league themselves. So to summarize some of the big points in this video, during the draft, you have to take risky picks and really hope they pan out. When you're in free agency, you can't be paying the big names while your team is still bad. You have to wait until you get to a more competitive point. And on the trade market, you have to go for the missing pieces, not necessarily a superstar, and wait for those missing pieces until you're already close. You don't want them too early and have them run out of their potential. We've seen other teams follow similar timelines to find success. The 2023 Nuggets and the 2011 Mavericks come to mind, but it's not a one-size-fits-all process. Some successful teams as of late who went another direction to win include the 2019 Raptors, the 2020 Lakers, and the 2016 Cavs. So I guess a rebuttal of my strategy would be, if you can sign LeBron, fuck your rebuild. That may sound ridiculous, but there really are some guys in the NBA that are too good to pass up, no matter where your team is at. If you have a guy like LeBron or Kawhi willing to come play for your team, your rebuild goes out the window, and you have to build a team to work with those guys while they're still in their prime. With that being said, I do want to ask, who's next? If you guys want to know who I think could follow this format that the Bucks use for success, I'll point you over to OKC. We know the risks they've taken with guys like Chet and Giddey, and if those moves play out successfully, you got to get ready to see them at the top. But let's not sleep on Indiana either. I think their moves are going under the radar. Assuming they have a couple more successful off seasons going forward, they give me a vibe similar to these younger Bucks teams. But either way guys, that's all the time I've got. We really appreciate the love we've been getting on the channel, and make sure to check out some of our other videos. Throw some suggestions down for future videos in the comments as well. We really hope you have a good one. Peace out, stay safe.